all of us as individuals have similar structures in our brain, but how our brain chooses to wire itself is going to be different. What I really wanted to do is for people to treat people as an individual rather than just assume we're all the same anyway.
You're listening to Parenting with Impact, a podcast for parents like you, raising complex kids to become capable, independent adults, even in this complicated world. Each episode brings expert insights and real-life strategies to help you parent with confidence, calm, and clarity. Here are your hosts, Elaine and Diane.
Welcome back, everybody, to another conversation in the Parenting with Impact podcast. I am really excited to share today's guest with you. My guest is Sue Langley, and I had the privilege of meeting her at the European Congress on Positive Psychology in the summer of 2024, where I was speaking on neurodiversity and she was speaking on neuroscience. So as you could imagine, we got along quite well. And I felt like she's done some really beautiful work and research. She teaches neuroscience in a really lovely, accessible way. And so I asked her if she'd come have a conversation with me to share with my amazing audience. So Sue, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Me too. We're both a little curious where we're going to go today, folks. So let's start by, why don't you speak yourself into the room? How did you get to be one of the leading, people in the world in this realm of positive psychology? I mean, clearly, just so you know, everybody, I was at this conference. There's not a soul there who didn't know Sue Langley. So, positive psychology world may be new to me, but you are not new to it. So how did you get into this world?
Well, I was going to say, you make it sound like I'm sort of famous, and I suppose I always think I'm a legend in my own lunchbox, and my lunchbox is quite small.
I feel quite the same. I get that completely.
So it's interesting because I think I never went the academic track or anything like that. For me, normal person doing normal things. I used to be a truck driver in Europe, but I was fascinated about human psychology and human behavior. And I did a A-level in psychology because I thought it would be interesting. And then I traveled around the world for a year. And then I found myself in a leadership role where I decided, rather than teaching my team sales, we were an Australia, New Zealand travel specialist, rather than teaching them sales, I would teach them some of the things that I'd learned about self-esteem, self-efficacy, confidence overall, emotions, etc., that I'd been learning just for fun. And I watched our profits double 2 years running. So I thought, well, clearly something's going well in that my team were more confident, more able, more comfortable. So from there, when I moved to Australia, I then did study a psychology degree, and I did a double degree in psychology and management. And then I did my master's in neuroscience of leadership. But I did all that while running my own business or starting my own business, because I really thought that I seemed to have the ability to synthesize the science. I didn't want to be an academic, but I enjoyed reading research papers, which not many people do. But what I really enjoyed is trying to translate it into real things. Like the very first research paper I read on post-traumatic growth, I translated it into my mind as sort of a race of who starts running first and what they do along the way, and trying to explain it in sort of different ways like that made people go, oh, now I get it. So for me, my master's in neuroscience and then studying in Venice at the Neuroscience School for Advanced Studies was really about how do I take the science and make it real for normal people, real people who have normal jobs, who are in leadership roles, who are running a family, who are running a home, who just want to be the best they can be. And I've really loved doing that ever since in the sort of positive psychology, emotion, and neuroscience space.
I love that. And I can so resonate, maybe not with the master's in neuroscience, but with this notion that there's this role for some of us in translating complex medical, scientific concepts into language that everyday people can understand and relate to, because it influences our lives. Like it matters for us to understand these things.
Yeah, it does. And I think for me, the more I've learned about the brain in particular, the more it's helped me understand why sometimes I and other people do the weird things that we do. We're sort of like, oh, now I get it. Yeah, that makes sense. But it also helps me then understand the system that is the human, whether it's focusing on neuroscience, whether it's the microbiome, whether it's the environment that we're surrounded by, the people we're surrounded by. So looking at everything from sort of biology through to environment and sort of system science, positive psychology for me is how do I take all of that to help myself, other people, teams, communities be the best they can be and to flourish.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting. One of the things I learned at the positive psychology conference, there's language in this realm, the language of flourish, right? The language of well-being. And I come from a coaching realm, so which it was kind of like positive psychology is doing the research that explains all of the why that we do what we do in coaching. So I had a lot of fun, as you guys can imagine. Um, when you think about this kind of biology and systems and human dynamics and neuroscience, what's important for parents to understand, particularly when you've got parents with kids with neurodivergence, atypical kids in some way or another in terms of their neurological development?
Mm. There's a few things, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert in neurodiversity as such, but I think when I first heard the term neurodiversity, however many years ago when that term first started, I kind of thought, well, everybody's neurodiverse.
Yes.
That was my first thought, is like every brain is different. So there are some similar structures. All of us as individuals have similar structures in our brain, but how our brain chooses to wire itself is going to be different. And I suppose what I really wanted to do is for people to treat people as an individual rather than just assume we're all the same anyway. So I think that's the first thing, is understanding our brain is plastic, it can change, but sometimes concerned about labeling and assuming everybody with a label. It's a bit like, I mean, hopefully we've got over this now, but once upon a time we would put people into the extroversion, introversion. You know, MBTI was debunked like 30 years ago, and still people use the MBTI labels for people. And so I'm always
The
cautious.
MBTI.
The Myers-Briggs type indicator, yeah. You know, even if I just use the extroversion, introversion, we go around and say, oh, extrovert, introvert, and assuming then every extrovert is the same, which is ridiculous. You
Right.
know, assuming every left-handed person is the same, or every American is the same, or every Australian is the same, that is ridiculous by itself. And it helps us in some ways to chunk things down, but it's not accurate. And so I do worry sometimes that from a neurodiversity perspective, we are usually using that term to label somebody who is different in a not so good way, as in there is a deficit or something. And I'm like, oh, can we just be careful of this? Because it's sometimes not always helpful. Sometimes it is. But if I give you an example, there was a lovely gentleman who flew from Vancouver to New Zealand to do our diploma of positive psychology and wellbeing many years ago. Absolutely gorgeous gentleman. I'm still in touch with him. And when he first came on the program, he said, he came up quietly to me and he said, that he had Tourette's. Now, Tourette's is a label that we would put on a neurodiverse person.
Mhm.
And I'm like, okay, cool. And he said, like, I won't swear at you, but he said, at some point, I'm going to ask you if you're a chicken or you want a chicken, or are you, the word chickens and stuff. And he said, and I might, if I'm nervous, I might have sort of, rock in my chair, or I might twitch in a little bit. I'm like, cool, no problem. And anyway, and he did, he introduced himself to everybody else. When he introduced himself, he let us know he had Tourette's. He said the word chickens a lot. Sometimes I would say, anybody got any questions? And he would just go chicken. And everybody just,
Rolled with it.
yeah, it was completely irrelevant. Although the funny story is that when he taught somebody to juggle, he kept going monkeys, chickens, ducks, monkeys, chickens, ducks. And now I still use that when I juggle. So he is with me all the time.
That's
But what I really, really loved is I watched the whole group be completely oblivious, if you like, to any Tourette's, and just treat him as Danny, which he is, and which he's amazing at being Danny. And I suppose that's one of the things sometimes I worry about is, yes, we need support and we need help to understand. But what I'd really love is for people to treat people as Danny, in this case, as opposed to a person with Tourette's. Nobody wants to be known for their label.
No, and yet as I'm hearing your story, like can you imagine what would have happened in that room had he not given you the
Oh,
head of that
absolutely.
chicken? And so
Yeah.
there is something very valuable about what I always say about our kids is if we don't give them an explanation for what they're struggling with, what they're going to make up is a whole lot worse. And they're going to
Oh,
that they're
absolutely.
lazy, crazy, or stupid.
Yes.
So we don't want that. So the label becomes a mechanism to help us understand what we might need support with.
Yeah. But again, to your point is, yes, I understand the importance of a label, but I'm nervous about then assuming everybody with Tourette's is the same because another
Agree.
person with Tourette's is different, same as another person with ADHD is different. So I suppose what I hope is from a neurodiverse perspective, we don't immediately go, okay, well, that's a deficit that we've got to try and fix or something. It's about having the conversation. It's about how does this play out for the person, whether it's because it's Tourette's or whether it's because, I don't know, everybody in a wheelchair is not in a wheelchair for the same
Same
reason.
reasons.
So I suppose maybe it's the human. I have a phrase, the future is human, and I do a lot of keynotes on this space. And I suppose I just would like people to treat people as human. The label is there and it's useful, but then let's treat the person as a person, whoever we might be, and understand the person for who they are, not just their label.
Well, and that is an extraordinarily helpful message for parents of young people who are learning to navigate these issues. Because part of what I see happen in our community is sometimes, as you say, parents get so fixated on what it is, either discovering it, naming it, like responding to it, that they almost do lose that connection to the human being that's having this experience. And that's kind of what I'm
Well,
hearing you saying.
yeah, and if I give you another example, there's a lovely gentleman, again, he came on our diploma, and before he came on, he was 27, and before he came on, he let us know that he was dyslexic. He said, I'm dyslexic, I might have trouble with the study and the writing, can we adjust? And we're like, yeah, sure, we have literacy, adjustments we can make for the assignments. And the week before he came on, his mother called, which I thought was interesting, bearing in mind he was 27.
Right. Yeah.
She said, I don't think my son should be doing this. He's dyslexic. He's not going to be able to cope. And I'm like, that's okay. We've already had a conversation. It's all good. He's sorted. And I'm like, I'm dealing with him. I'm not dealing with his mother.
Right.
He's chosen to come on. And anyway, he arrived and he reminded me that he's the dyslexic person and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, all good. You tell me what you need. Let's work together. And again, as far as I was concerned, we'll call him Peter for the sake of the podcast. Um, anyway, we did an exercise on day 5. So it's a 6-day immersion program. We did an exercise on day 5 that requires writing. It's a journaling, expressive writing type exercise for 15 minutes. And I gave him a look as if to say, I'm not going to single you out and tell everybody in front of this that you might have a problem with this. But I sort of gave him a look and a bit of a thumbs up. And he was like, yeah, yeah. And he trundled off and he starts writing in the room. And then after a while, I can see on his face, he's looking quite distressed. And he gets up and he walks outside. Now, bearing in mind it's an immersion week in Tasmania and it's snowing outside and about 3 degrees, I'm a little concerned.
Right.
I walk out, I give him a moment and I walk out and he's sort of hunched down under the eaves. It's raining, it's snowing. And I sort of look at him and he's got tears streaming down his face. And I sort of gave him a bit of a look and a bit of a thumbs up and he went thumbs up back and carried on writing, whatever. And when he came back in, I asked the group, I didn't pick on him, I asked the group, what did you get out of the exercise? And he chose to put his hand up and he said, my entire life I have labeled myself and I've been labeled as dyslexic. And he said, I've just written a letter to myself forgiving myself for that.
Oh.
And he said, I know. And he said, as he wrote, he felt his hand relax on the page and the words just kept coming. He realized it didn't matter whether he was spelling them right or whatever that didn't matter. He just wanted to get his thoughts out. But he said, I've never felt so free in my life of forgiving myself for the constraints that I put on myself for calling myself, I am dyslexic.
Instead of having, yeah.
Yeah, and it was beautiful. And this gentleman, he went on to become a travel blogger. Which I just think is really cool because he'd allowed it to hold him back.
Yes.
And dyslexia doesn't mean you can't do anything. It means you might have challenges of sort of reading, learning, transposing, in his case. But it didn't mean he couldn't write. It didn't mean he couldn't use Grammarly or some sort of other thing to check his writing if he wanted to. And it meant he could still express his ideas. And so again, that was a lovely example for me of a label can be useful to get extra support, but how it plays out for that wonderful person that we'll call Peter, we need to allow that freedom because his mum probably called us for the best reasons.
Yes.
She wanted to protect her son, but he's 27. He's figured out a way to be in the world. And if we can treat him for who he is and the wonderfulness of, what he can bring to the world, the dyslexia kind of pales into insignificance after a bit. And that's what I really love if we can give that space for people.
I love that. It's such a beautiful story. So many things come up. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be right back.
Do you recognize current ADHD interventions fall short? At Dig Coaching, we have developed a new field of engineering and a new ADHD intervention called cognitive ergonomics from the inside out. To learn more, visit cognitive-ergonomics.com.
Welcome back, everybody. My guest is Sue Langley, and she is a beautiful storyteller, as you've probably heard. And I love the notion of allowing whatever our brain wiring is doing to be to understand it without it defining us with based on its limitations, which is what I hear you talking about.
Yeah.
And it's interesting in the autism world, there's a lot of conversation about, do I have autism? Am I autistic? And it's interesting because that community is claiming the label in a different way.
Yeah.
And I'm watching the kind of the shift in the neurodiversity community. We don't have that much time left, but you said something earlier and I want to go back to it. When you were talking about the brain is plastic and it can change, the term you used was everybody's neurodiverse. How our brain chooses to wire itself is different. And that is a lovely language. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you? How do you understand the differences in brain wiring from that lens?
Yeah, well, I suppose I think the brain is amazing. If you think about the way it works, we've got neurons, and I always imagine the palm of my hand is a neuron, and then the pokey bits that I call them, as in the axons and the dendrites, are the bits that allow one neuron to talk to another. And then, of course, we've got the neurobiology of the chemicals that sort of jump across the gaps that allow one neuron to talk to another. So if we think about neurogenesis is can I grow new neurons? And for many years, and certainly when I went to school, which I don't think was that long ago, but when I went to school, we were kind of taught that once you reached a certain age, usually somewhere around the 25 mark, you had all your neurons and they'd only die off from there. We call it grey matter. And it's like, oh, well, you've reached your peak and it's done. Right. Thankfully, we now know that's not true. And for me, that was really helpful because I don't know why, but I never injured myself much at school. But when I did, it was always my head. As in, I got concussion a couple of times. I fell off a horse and cracked my head. I, walked into a wall once and cracked my head. So I was a bit worried about that I was killing my neurons, Right. And it was really lovely to learn that we can still grow new neurons into older age. A wonderful study of people that took up running at the age of 40, were growing new neurons, so new neurogenesis. But that's probably one piece. But the other piece is the connections, the pokey bits, the axons and dendrites that allow one neuron to talk to another. If I keep running down a certain pathway, and we think about this as habits, I might have habits of behavior, habits of thought, habits of emotion. I think of them as neural pathways. And like a lot of people do, how strong is that pathway? Is it the super highway that, runs from one city to another and therefore it's easy to run down? Or is it the little dirt path that you have to sort of duck under, trees and over roots and things? Well, obviously the easiest one for my brain to run down is the one that I've always run down. So I suppose it's not saying we have complete choice. If I grow up in an environment where, I don't know. If I feel sad, I deal with it with a bottle of vodka. And if I feel angry, I deal with it with punching and kicking things. then that's the neural pathway that I've learned. Now, does it mean I can't learn new pathways? Of course not. Of course I can learn more, but it might be harder because I don't have good role models or I don't have an environment to support. But what we do know is people can grow new neurons. You can even Google, you can see a new neuron being created in real time, which is kind of cool. So I think for me is remembering that, we might read these books on, how to build great habits or, I love Atomic
Tiny
Habits.
habits or atomic
Yeah.
habits. Yeah. Yeah.
So they're great. But what people sometimes fail to recognize is that they're neural pathways in your brain, and it's not just behavioral habits. It can be habits of thought and habits of emotion. So, for instance, if I'm continually complaining about stuff, that's the neural pathways that I'm running down. If I'm continually looking for the good in the world, that's the pathways that I run down. So I suppose what I like to think is, what neural pathways am I creating with the things that I do every day, the things that I think, the things that I feel? What am I reinforcing? And this is the same for me or for others. Like, again, I had this lovely diploma student who her son had ADHD and was really struggling at school. And she chose to flip it after doing the diploma and telling him it was a superpower and how could he use his superpower wisely. So she helped him flip the challenges that he was having into something where he could learn to self-regulate because he could see it as a superpower. And that's a lovely way of looking of picking strengths. I've got another story of a girl who was going to be expelled from school because she was always getting into trouble, leading other people astray, doing things she shouldn't, etc. That when the teachers, thankfully, due to a lovely colleague of mine who encouraged them before they suspended her, she encouraged the teachers to try and flip it and spot strengths and see it as strengths. And initially they thought, oh, she doesn't have any. She's just really annoying. She's always getting into trouble. She's,
Well,
but eventually,
she's got a lot of leadership skills right there.
well, that was one of the things they eventually picked up on. Well, she's clearly got leadership skills because she's leading people astray. They picked up on persuasion because she could always persuade other people to get into trouble with her.
Right.
And anyway, when they started giving her those as strengths, she became less disruptive and she started using her strengths for good. And she ended up being like a big sister in the school for other girls coming in from low socioeconomic and challenged families, that she could be like the big sister to support them. And that was a beautiful way of transforming those strengths that had initially been seen as weaknesses into channeling them into a positive way. So I suppose for me, if I think about neuroplasticity, if I think about the neurobiology, if I think about the influence now with the microbiome on what we eat, on how it changes our neurochemical makeup, etc., we have some choices, and we especially have choices as parents. We might not be able to fix things, and I'm doing that in little quotation marks, but does our child, does our friend, does our colleague, does our partner need to be fixed? Or can we find a way of really helping channel and create new neural pathways that are going to be supportive and helpful for that person rather than seeing them as a problem to be fixed?
Oh, that's so beautiful. I could have this conversation for the next 3 hours. And of course, we have to stop. And when we started this conversation, Sue, we both said, let's just see where it goes. Right. And as we've gone through this conversation through understanding how to shift a label into an asset, or not to let the label define us. And then I hear you talk about growing new neurons and all of the chemical piece, and where you landed in this conversation is exactly the message that parents of complex kids, I believe, need to hear most, which is these kids aren't broken. They don't need to be fixed. And our job is to help them see their capacity, to see what their strengths are, to see what's possible for them, and to believe. One of the conversations, so I did a podcast episode with Andreas Kraft,
One
of the keynoters at this conference that Sue and I went to. And I'll link to that in the show notes, everybody. But we had a conversation about his research on hope. And what he came to in that research was how important it is for parents to believe what's possible for their kids, to create a vision. And I hear you saying that from a different lens, but still, that this is not about their being broken. It's about by helping them see their strength, we help them actually rewire their brain.
Mm. And I think just on that, Elaine, one of the things that I think is really important to note is I'm not for 1 minute suggesting we can all be anything we want to be. That's a very privileged statement to say we can be anything we want to be. And again, the example I often use is Usain Bolt is probably one of the world's best runners. And it is very unlikely at the age and physicality that I'm at that even if I went running every day, I am never going to beat Usain Bolt.
No.
But what I do know is if I practice running, I'll get better at running. And this is what I think is important is you're not saying anybody can be, the next Einstein or the next Nelson Mandela or whoever you want to pick. But what we do know is we can all be better than we were. And we know this from even the research from Mika Bartels, who talks about the genetics. Yes, some people might be happier than others, but all of us have the capacity to get happier, if you like. And so I think that's what's a really important thing is we're not saying everybody can be anything they want to be, but we are saying that anybody can possibly be better in some ways if we can, to your point, develop those things, see them as strengths. Whenever people come and say, oh, I was broken, it's like, you're not broken. Life has happened. And life is going to happen to all of us, but you're not broken. You're you. You're the amazing person you are. Why is it I can see it and you can't?
Which is so often the case. And the other thing to what you're saying is that when we practice, we can get better. And when we identify and practice on a strength, that's got an even more compounding capacity.
Oh,
very
absolutely.
often in the neurodivergent space, we see a kid who struggles in math or struggles in reading, and then we have them just keep working on the thing they struggle with the most instead of highlighting the things that are their gifts and strengths. So there's that piece. It's not that they can't get better at the math, but at some point you're going to have diminishing returns.
Absolutely. And again, are we using their strengths to do this? And I heard this wonderful story about a boy who was struggling in maths, and the teacher tried to identify what he loved. He loved parkour. And so the maths teacher asked him to create a parkour course around the school and use that to teach him maths. Now, how cool is that for a teacher?
That is just a beautiful story. I love
it.
Okay. I hate to end this conversation, but we have to bring it to a close. Everybody, my guest is Sue Langley from the Langley Group. You can reach her at suelangley.com or langleyGroup.com.au, we think, but it's definitely on the...
It's definitely .au.
So that you can find it. Sue, do you have a favorite quote or motto that you want to share?
Yeah, well, I have sort of so many that there are lots of sayings I'm known for, sort of, you know it, do you do it, treat yourself as a scientific experiment, etc. But there are a couple of things that I think are really important. One of my sayings is, I talk about emotions a lot. Emotions are data, they're information, they're trying to tell us something. And so one of the things that I often remind people is sometimes it's really important to get comfortable with the uncomfortable emotions. We often try and push them away when we're feeling anxious and frustrated and things like that, but they're there to teach us something. And so sometimes getting comfortable with the uncomfortable can be one of the pathways to flourishing. We know that the pursuit of happiness by itself usually has diminishing returns again if we're trying to attain it. And sometimes being able to be comfortable with all of the emotions can be helpful. But I might just share one more, if I may, which was when I started my own business, I did find for the first few years a bit of a struggle. You know, I was out there, had no experience, never been a consultant, new in Australia, didn't have any networks. You know, I basically didn't do what the most sensible people do, as in they work for a consulting firm for a while, then they go out on their own and they consult back to the consulting firm. So I had none of that. And we have these little cards that we use, this little pack of cards called Inspire Action cards. And we created them at the Langley Group, and they're images on one side, and on the backs of them, they're real playing cards. But they have inspirational quotes on the red ones and actions to do with positive psychology on the black ones. And so I just had another meeting with another 55-year-old white male when I was a 30-year-old female. where I knew I wasn't going to get the work and I knew I didn't have the experience. And I was feeling really flat and down and low. And I was living in Sydney and I was going across the Harbour Bridge on the bus, heading home thinking, oh, this is too hard. I'm going to have to go and get a job again. And I picked my pack of cards out that was in my handbag and I searched for an image to represent how I felt. And I turned it over, and on the back was a saying that was really useful for me, and I've used it. I've thrown it back at people many times. It was, most people give up just as they're about to succeed.
Isn't that the truth? Yeah.
And I'm really grateful for that card because 20 years later, I'm still in business, and very grateful.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. There are times where I can so relate to that feeling of deflation, right? Like, is this really worth it? And then something happens. And if you can look for the signs, you recognize the signs as you did, very often there's a message to remind us.
Well, especially whether it's a business, whether it's as a parent, a partner in your role, just reminding ourselves, most people give up just as they're about to succeed. So we might get that breakthrough around strengths. We might be able to support somebody, but let's not give up too soon.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking the time and having this conversation.
Thank you, Elaine. It's been delightful. I could talk for hours too.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. To those of you listening, take a minute and ask yourself, what's your insight from this conversation? I know what Sue and I have been talking about, but what's come up for you in this conversation? Was there a particular relationship you were thinking about, a particular scenario or dynamic? What's your awareness from what you've heard today? And perhaps what's one action you might want to take based on that insight or that awareness that you have that you want to bring forward with you into your week this week? And as always, my friends, thank you for what you're doing for yourself and for your kids. You make an extraordinary difference in their lives. And I really want to acknowledge and honor your presence, your tuning in, your listening to this, and the work you're doing as a parent or as a professional to support these amazing young people. See you on the next call. Take care, everybody.
You've been listening to the Parenting with Impact podcast with Elaine and Diane. For more information on the Impact Parents community or to join Sanity School for Parents, please visit impactparents.com. If you like what you've heard, please share this podcast with friends who need similar guidance and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.